Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, yesterday in New Delhi, authorities had imposed a curfew in 4 areas as violence raged through the Indian capital during the official visit of US President Donald Trump. The death toll, as reported by various sources, including the TGB hospital in Delhi, has risen to 20, with hundreds injured. The Delhi police has been accused of looking the other way as pro-CAA Hindutva mobsters attacked peaceful protesters in Muslim-majority areas. 2 mosques were desecrated. In fact, now the update is 3 mosques. Private property damaged and shops were looted. Members of the right-wing RSS organization vandalized a mosque yesterday in the Ashok Nagar area during riots with protesters rallying against the law. You're watching footages on your screen of that incident where a saffron flag, which the Hindutva mobsters or followers are identified by, are trying to put it on top of the mosque. Now, sit-ins have been taking place across Delhi against a new citizenship law, the CAA, since December last year. The Citizenship Amendment Act is seen by protesters as a threat to India's secular constitution. It's also seen as a way of dividing India on ethnic and religious lines, and critics are calling it anti-Muslim. So we will be talking to our guests about several questions that arise from the situation in India's capital these past 3 days, which revolves essentially around the silence from the BJP leadership, the failure of the Delhi police force in preventing these 20 deaths and restoring calm, and also what does it say about President Trump, who, hailing Prime Minister Modi's efforts to promote religious freedom while Delhi around him was burning? So let me introduce who we're speaking to today. We have Dr. Taslim Rehmani, an analyst and National Secretary of SDPI and President of Muslim Political Council of India. He's joining us today from Delhi. And we also have Mr. Nishant, Verma, political analyst, also joining us from Delhi. Welcome to both of you to the program. I'd like to begin with you, Dr. Rehmani, on your what you feel at this moment, considering these 3 days of violence, the situation, 20 are dead, by some accounts 200 injured. What exactly happened? How did the Delhi police fail?
This was a pre-planned attempt of an ethnic cleansing at the name of CAA. Basic intention of these goons were to discourage, frighten, and make a fear psychosis amongst the anti-CAA protesters, so that many protests, at least 22 protests are continuous sit-ins are conducted here in Delhi, and more than 2,000 all over the country. So they want to discourage and dismantle these anti-CAA protesters by conducting this violence. And they use the Delhi police at their side. All the RSS allied organizations has managed the goons from around the Delhi, like the Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. They came in hundreds of number. They vandalized the properties and they killed at least 25 people and more than 200, and several mosques and madrasas has been burned and people killed around there. Delhi police and the BJP leaders were very openly announcing and threatening the protesters in Delhi before all this thing has happened. And for last 2 months, they were planning to organize such a pogrom kind of a situation in Delhi, but the Delhi police was silent, and all the intelligence operators were silent over that. The Kapil Mishra has issued a threat on the 23rd Feb itself that they will dismantle all these protests by themselves if the in the presence of
and that was pretty much that started it. That comment by Mishra was pretty much that got the ball rolling here. But let me get your take on this, Mr. Verma. As Dr. Rehmani says, this was ethnic cleansing, this was pre-planned. Considering this is the Delhi police here, purportedly the best in the country, it stood on the sidelines or wasn't able to curtail it. Do you have the same opinion here, that they not failed, but this was a deliberate negligence?
Either on the administrative part, I definitely agree that this is a failure from Delhi police. I maintain that Delhi police is one of the finest polices available in India, which is doubtless. But then what happens is that we know across the world, even in India, it is the administrative skill set which comes into play. Now, I think there was definitely a play in terms of political play in order to get this violence initiated, and I definitely call it BJP's game plan, because that's how they've been doing it here in last 2-3 months if we look at it properly. But on the other hand, the Delhi police was well equipped but short in number. And that is where the Delhi police failed. The Delhi police, I charged them that they, while having Donald Trump, the president of US, visiting Delhi, would have had a depletion in the staff, but then they had extra paramilitary forces and other companies as reserves, which they later, 3-4 days later, they moved in. Should have been brought in earlier. It should have been, this entire thing that was initiated through an unwarranted hue cry by this fellow called Kapil Mishra, who belongs to Bharatiya Janata Party, which was not desired. And this should have been, nipped in the butt right in the beginning by the administration. Unfortunately, the Delhi police falls under the administrative skill set of the Home Minister of India, which is who is Mr. Amit Shah. And I blame him I hold him responsible for this failure.
Not only you, Mr. Verma, but many right now, especially the kind of reports we're seeing coming out of India, the critics are saying that this was the responsibility of Mr. Amit Shah, like you mentioned. The Home Minister's, the Delhi police reports to the Home Minister, but there was a lot of silence. In fact, earlier on today, we saw Shri Prakash Javadekar in a press conference talking about that this was just an opportunity for opposition parties to be playing dirty politics, that in fact, Mr. Amit Shah at the time was meeting with Dalits, with other minorities, addressing their complaints or their concerns. Dr. Rehmani, with the kind of comments we're getting in defense for the silence that we are seeing from the BJP leadership, what exactly is the game plan here? How long, as you said, this is a planned incident, the way the government reacted. What is the next step then?
You see, it is basically it was the Bharatiya Janata Party led government, led central government, which has planned and executed this pogrom. And secondly, it was the local Delhi government, that is the Aam Aadmi Party, which the Muslims has voted for him just last fortnight and blocked and mass voted for him. And even he was silent. He's a man of protest. He's a hero of protest. He did not come out of his home. He did not go and get out the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi to the went to the police commissioner or the affected areas. He did not visit it for 3 days. And earlier he did not come to the Shaheen Bagh and the Jamia and the JNU when the police atrocities and brutalities were committed by the police. He was silent over that. So it looks like that the political classes other than the BJP who claim to be the secular, they are also having law and want to teach a lesson to the LCCAA protesters. So the Kejriwal, the last time the residents of Kejriwal, when some protesters reached his home to make him awake and come out and to do something to rescue those who are being killed or injured, he did not come out. Rather, he ordered the police to cane charge the protesters, and water cannons were used against those. And some of the protesters were arrested at the residence of Arvind Kejriwal. So the political classes also, most of them are mute spectators. Now, after the period when the 100% business establishment are burned and 25 lives are lost, then only some people are coming out. And today morning there is a flag march by the police. So it seems that they are trying to make a rehearsal of a bigger kind of a civil war to be unleashed over the country by those who want to promulgate the two-nation theory again in the country. And it's all for that two-nation theory. That's what I see behind this point.
You're referring to an incident. You're talking about the Minister of Delhi, Arvind Kejriwal, who himself has received a lot of heat because he tweeted when all of this was happening, he was flattering US's First Lady attending a happiness class in a Delhi school while Delhi around him burned. So when he did that, he got a lot of people criticizing him, saying pretty much what you have also said. And at that point, when he tweeted, 6 people had already died, including 1 police constable. And then he goes on to say, he says that violence won't benefit anybody and that he appealed to the public to resort to, Gandhian-style non-violence protests. What Gandhi reference is he giving there? Weren't these peaceful protests where pro-CAA Hindutva mobs just basically crashed in while the security forces couldn't do much, Mr. Verma?
You see, primarily Delhi has witnessed the rulerships like right from Ibrahim Lodi to Narendra Modi. So if I need to understand Delhi, Delhi has been ruled brutally by many. I would not talk of much of Arvind Kejriwal because he is a toothless tiger when it comes to law and order of the state called Delhi. The issue is that primarily we need to understand in India, there is anti-CAA, the Citizenship Amendment 2019 anti-protest going on since few months. But then we also need to understand that to counter it, there is something called support CAA, demonstrations, protests or rallies that were happening and continue to happen in this country. Primarily, the ruling dispensation alleges that the opposition is behind the anti-CAA protest and they don't have any proof of that. But something that everybody on this land and across the world knows is that the pro-CAA demonstration and the drive has been done only by the ruling dispensations party, the political party by the name Bharatiya Janata Party, which has the Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, in the center. So, if any clashes which are happening, quote-unquote, pro-CAA versus anti-CAA belongs to people, whereas pro-CAA belongs only to that political party.
Right.
And that is the reason I must apprise you that the Honorable Delhi High Court has wished, through a hearing on these riots, Delhi riots, has wished and advised the Solicitor General of India, Mr. Tushar Mehta, that he should advise the Police Commissioner of Delhi to book on criminal charges at least these three BJP leaders, Anurag Thakur, who happens to be a minister in the Modi government in the center, Mr. Parvesh Verma, who also happens to be a member of parliament of BJP in the Modi government, and Mr. Kapil Mishra, who as a BJP leader recently lost the model town elections of assembly in Delhi, but is the person who is generally blamed and alleged that his instigation initiated this current Delhi riot 2020.
Okay. And while all of this is happening, let's not forget that President Trump is hailing Prime Minister Modi's efforts to promote religious freedom while Delhi is burning around him. This is President Trump in India yesterday during a presser. Let's take a listen.
So we did talk about religious freedom, and I will say that the Prime Minister was incredible on what he told me. He wants people to have religious freedom, and very strongly. And he said that in India they have worked very hard to have great and open religious freedom. We talked about it for a long time, and I really believe that's what he wants.
So there it is, the comments from a press briefing that President Trump later gave. Coming back to you very quickly, Mr. Rehmani, we're running out of time. Dr. Rehmani, these comments come at a time where it is known to all, not just what Mr. Verma talked about, that this is the ruling party behind these mobsters who were creating this chaos, but also knowing Prime Minister Modi's history as the Gujarat Chief Minister of what happened in the Gujarat riots.
All this violence has been planned meticulously with the timings of Donald Trump's visit to Delhi. You would remember that when President Barack Obama came, when Bill Clinton came over here, on all the occasions where some American president has visited India, all such things has happened. The Chetty Singh Pura has happened in Bill Clinton time and the Barack Obama time also. So whenever a US president visits here, such things happen in India just to create an impression, to create.
Right. So, Dr. Rehmani, sorry to cut you there. We're running out of time. Thank you so much for your opinion there, and also Mr. Verma for speaking to us on what is unfolding, especially in the past few days. I'd like to introduce another voice very quickly. Mr. Arun Kumar, an economist, is joining us from Delhi. Mr. Kumar, now we know that there were deals signed between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi on defense, on energy, on telecom, but there was no a final deal signed over trade, much anticipated by the BJP-led government. Shed some light on this for us, how this affects India's economy at this point.
You know, just like Mr. Trump has been very transactional with every country. He's a very transactional man. He's a businessman. He knows how to bargain. He's been bargaining with China, with Europe, etc., and he's also been bargaining with India. And so, therefore, tariffs were raised on Indian products like steel and aluminum more than a year back. and then the general preference that was given under the WTO, that was withdrawn. Recently, India has been characterized as a developed country rather than as a developing country. And he keeps saying that India has been not good to the USA. So in that sense, it was expected that a trade deal would not come through. And even at the end of his press conference, he said that at the end of the year, a trade deal may come through, but he was not very sure because India has been demanding certain concessions, which the US is not willing to give. So, he said, even if the trade deal does not come through, then we'll have something better, which is very uncertain what that better means. So in other words, there's no clarity whether a trade deal is coming or not, but he has come here to get concessions for the USA. And that's what he managed to get. He's been complaining that the trade deficit that the US has with India is very large, and he's asked India to import more. So this defense deal plus more purchase of energy like gas and so on, all these things are going to reduce the trade deficit with the US. So he's forcing India to give concessions without they giving any concessions to India, because he feels that in the past, India has got concessions without the US getting concessions. He always raises the issue of Harley-Davidson, which is hardly a tiny, tiny, minuscule fraction of the trade between India and the US. And he then says that, India has not been fair. So he uses that as an example of how tariffs that India has imposed are higher than what the tariffs that America imposed on Indian goods. So in other words, he wants India to reduce tariffs on US goods and so on, which is very difficult because India is not the same as the USA. There are a large number of poor farmers, especially as far as milk is concerned, or, for instance, in medical supplies, the medical stents, etc., that were coming from the US, or the implants were very high priced, and therefore India wanted their prices to be reduced. So that is another bone of contention, and I think he's got his way, because in this thing, there's a deal on the health where they're talking about good health for each country and so on. So he's got a lot of concessions without really conceding very much to the Indian side.
In fact, not conceding anything at all, because even in the defense deal, the agreement was that India would purchase, $3 billion worth of helicopters from the US.
Yes, but there's an offset clause, so about $600 million worth of orders would be placed in India, and India is not a great manufacturer of defense production. So therefore, India has been eyeing purchase of some of these helicopters, etc., for quite some time. But I think more than that, it's the strategic partnership that is being promised, where India would be a strategic partner. The Quad idea is being revived, and I think it's directed against China. I think Japan, Australia, US, India, Quad relationship, and they're planning to hold exercises, etc., together. So in a sense, the US has been wanting India as a strategic partner.
But still, Mr. Kumar, I would argue that even India as a strategic partner, as a bulwark against China, especially now with the kind of geostrategic politics in play in this region, one would think that India would be given some concessions. Instead, what we've seen, in fact, from June 2019, as you mentioned, the preferential trade status was removed. And more recently, India lost another $260 million worth of subsidies once it was categorized as a developed country, because the US argued that now it's part of the G20. So that $142 billion worth of bilateral trade between the US and India at this point now, how does it affect the economy of India, considering that it's already struggling with some of the worst growth numbers?
So, our exports have not been doing very well for the last several years. They're not growing very much, and imports are also having a negative growth rate because the economy has been slowing down. So India would have loved to increase its export to the US, but it doesn't look like there is much on that count that we've got. Instead, what, in the business meeting with the business leaders, he has got promises of billions of dollars of investment from Indian big business in USA, whether it be in steel or in, like the IT sector and other such sectors. So in other words, we haven't managed to get very much. And as I said in the beginning, he's a very transactional man. He knows that he's very strong and that other countries need USA and the US market. And for that, he extracts concessions out of every country, whether it be China now negotiating with the US and offering to reduce tariffs, or India, giving concessions. But I think what he was referring to was also the fact that in the last 3 budgets, they've increased customs duties on large number of items so as to allow Make in India to progress. And I think he's weighing against that.
He's
and
weighing
that has been one of the problems.
Mr. Kumar, thank you so much for joining us here on Newswire. Unfortunately, we've run out of time now. We'll have to take a quick short break. We'll be back to discuss what Mubarak has left as a legacy in Egypt. Welcome back to Newswire. Now, former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, who ruled Egypt for almost 3 decades, he died yesterday from a long illness in the intensive care unit of a Cairo military hospital, where he underwent surgery just a few weeks ago. He was 91 years old. A former Air Force officer, he was vice president during Anwar Sadat's presidency, seated right next to him when Sadat was assassinated back in 1981. Now, Hosni Mubarak ruled as president for 30 years with an iron fist, as most critics call it. He silenced popular secular political movements and leaders that might have proven to be challenging to his monopoly on power. He was seen as a reliable ally by Washington and other Western capitals as he provided a kind of check, or what they believed, against an Islamist takeover of Egypt. He also provided that challenge to Iran that the West badly needed in the region. But most importantly, he preserved the peace treaty with Israel in return for billions of US aid. He was seen largely invincible because he had survived many assassination attempts. But it was the 2011 revolution that finally forced him to step down. After 18 days of protests during the Arab Spring, Hosni Mubarak gave up 3 decades of holding on to power. And after he stepped down, Hosni Mubarak and his 2 sons, they were arrested and they were tried for a number of charges, including corruption and a conspiracy to kill demonstrators in the Arab Spring. This was right after General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Egypt's current leader, came into power. So in June 2012, he was sentenced to life in prison, only to be overturned by 2017 by an appeals court, in which he was exonerated. Now, the government of Egypt has announced there will be a military funeral. What we'll be talking about today is what legacy did Mubarak leave behind? And is today's Egypt better than it was during his tenure? Let's find out from the experts. We'll be today to Mr. Guy Burton. He's a Middle East expert, also a visiting fellow at the LSE Middle East Center, and he is joining us today from Brussels. We also have with us Mr. Sami Hamdi, also a Middle East expert and editor-in-chief of International Interest. He's joining us from Tunisia. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Samdi, about the basic question we're looking to address today. In your opinion, what is the legacy that Hosni Mubarak left behind?
I think he leaves behind a mixed legacy, but I don't think it's because of his particular time in power. I think it's because of the way Egypt is today, the ensuing chaos, the aftermath of the revolution of the Arab Spring that saw Morsi's tumultuous year come to an end via a military coup, and Sisi, who brought Egypt back into the human rights abuses, back into a struggling economy, and essentially ruling or presiding over an Egypt that can be described as chaotic. I think Mubarak, because he died in this period of time, in this 8 years after the Arab Spring, in which many Egyptians believe that none of their aspirations, none of their hopes were fulfilled. There is a sort of nostalgia with regards to Hosni Mubarak, a nostalgia not necessarily for his rule, but for the stability and security that was there in his rule. There is this sort of nostalgia for a time in which the Egyptians at least could have some sort of certainty over what would happen tomorrow. And this is the danger, this is the problem, this is the real issue with regards to the historical narrative that is now being written. Because people seem to have some sort of forgotten the fact that Mubarak, Egypt was renowned for its human rights abuses. It was renowned for the torture in its prisons. Many movies used to joke that when the Americans could not conduct torture in their own prisons, they would relocate them to Egypt because everything was available there, whether it's electrocution, whether it's hanging from the ceilings. Mubarak's regime was known for these kind of human rights abuses. But because of the current chaos, because of Sisi's rule, because of the inability of the Egyptian political elite to give to the aspirations or respond to the aspirations of the Egyptians who did the revolution in 2011. There is a sort of nostalgia about Hosni Mubarak, which is very dangerous because it is in Sisi's benefit. It is in the military's benefit. It is in the army's benefit. You mentioned there will be a military funeral. This idea that Mubarak, despite those 30 years of immense human rights abuses, of crackdown, of monopoly on power, he deserves this military funeral. People will come out, they will cry for him, and the army will have this PR boost that will benefit Sisi. I'm not saying that we should whip a dead man. I'm saying that this is the historical narrative that is being written. If Mubarak had died at any other time, we would not be talking about it.
Yeah, I hear you on that. You're talking about the nostalgia here, because let's go back to 2011 when there was a revolutionary rising. And Mr. Burton, if you could weigh in on this, essentially it was seen not just his downfall, but then it's also being questioned as we speak to Mr. Samdi from that light, that the downfall of the regime, was that what took place as well? Or did the situation worsen for the Egyptians?
I mean, to answer the question about the revolution in 2011, certainly there was a popular uprising that wanted him out. But really, you know, in the end, who actually got rid of him were the military, the people around Mubarak. And so, yes, you had this sort of year and a half where, you know, there was an opening up in Egyptian politics, and the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, both won elections to the parliament as well as the presidency. But the power that really stayed behind the throne was really the military, and they made that very, very clear when they overthrew, you know, the former president Mohamed Morsi in July 2013. So, you know, you have really a continuation of military rule. So I concur with what your other correspondent is saying, that there is a sense that given the nature of the Sisi regime, which is particularly you know, abhorrent and particularly, you know, sort of harsh on human rights, that in a way that Mubarak can almost be seen sort of in a more positive light. Yet it's very clear that, you know, his rule was pretty repressive. He extended the state of emergency a number of times. He clamped down on various sort of civil society movements, including you know, Muslims who wanted more sort of political influence. And I think that is obviously one of the sort of features about both Mubarak and the Sisi regime, sort of the role of Islam. If you can compare that to sort of neighboring Tunisia, where the revolution accommodated Islamists into the democratic process, this has been denied to them in Egypt, effectively.
And you talk about Morsi came in with elections. I mean, he didn't last very long before the military stepped in. Mr. Hamdi, also the tyranny we see in Egypt today, it is right now on the list of, it's right there at number 3 of countries that have the most jailed journalists. I mean, there's 60,000 political prisoners languishing in Egyptian jails at the moment. So with respect to the nostalgia you talk about, the precedent had pretty much been set during Mubarak's tenure then.
I think when we're talking about Morsi's rule and this blip between Mubarak's rule and Sisi's rule, I don't think it was the military who orchestrated their return back. I think it was the free media. I think it was the likes of Bassem Youssef. It was the likes of Baradei. It was the international community that had no idea how to react to the changes in Egypt. And in that chaos, the army managed to find a way back. Because we have to remember that in 2011, the protest was so large, the army could not continue to hold on to Mubarak. They feared that if they held on to him, then they would also be brought into the line of fire of the people who were protesting. In that year, Bassem Youssef, the other media, free media, they annihilated any respect for Egyptian politicians. Baradei would use the international community to question election results, to demand coalition governments, to ensure and then claim that democracy doesn't mean the ballot box. Democracy means everybody should participate with one another. The European Union had no idea how to react to the fact that Islamists were winning in Tunisia, they were winning in Libya, they were winning in Egypt, they were already dominant in Sudan, they were expanding in the region. One EU diplomat once told me that when they were talking to Morsi about Islam and democracy, Morsi would respond and say we were the majority, and the EU would respond and say that's not enough. In other words, this environment, the army couldn't believe their luck. The army who thought that they had been defeated and they might be ousted from the economy, after 1 year suddenly found, oh wait, there's an opportunity for us to come back to power. Fantastic. Naguib Sawirs, the billionaire, came out openly and said, I was providing food for people to go out and protest against Morsi. And when the army came back, you have to remember, Ayza, that Ala al-Aswani, Muhammad Anwar al-Sadat, all of these other prominent liberal figures came out calling for a military coup. They called for the army to return. The army could not believe its luck. And this is why when we're talking about nostalgia for Mubarak, the nostalgia was not orchestrated by the army. The return of the army is not orchestrated solely by the army. It was this sort of, how do we deal with democracy in the Muslim world?
Right.
How do we deal with a democracy that brings in these Islamist powers? And this is why when we're looking at Mubarak now, and it's very interesting that my learned friend from LSE is talking about the idea that Mubarak clamped down on the Islamists and clamped down this idea on Islam coming into some sort of government in Egypt. That is fundamental. This is the key theme that played in Egypt.
Right.
The international community didn't know how to react. Sisi came back to power, Mubarak dies, he's going to have a military funeral, and now everybody's going to think, oh, look at this chaos that is so bad. Mubarak's time was much better, let's give it back to the army. Everything is going back towards the army. But I think we should not give the army too much credit. It's also about the fact that the Egyptian people didn't realize what they had, and the international community had no idea how to react to it.
But if hit the nail on the head there, it was the question about the Islamists and what the Western world was baffled about and was worried about, them coming into power, talking about Hosni Mubarak. He himself, when he was there, as severe as the tortures were, as bad as the clampdown was, but let's not forget that 5 US presidents backed him. They gave him the kind of support that kept him in power for so long, Mr. Burton.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you had in your package at the very start about, Mubarak was a very good friend to the United States and was, and as far as the United States was concerned, they're important. They wanted to see stability in the region, and of course, Mubarak also maintained the Camp David peace agreement with Israel, which actually Sadat, Mubarak's predecessor, had signed. Although it wasn't a very warm relationship, it was a cold one, but it was one that kept the peace. And certainly, if we think about a lot of the tensions that have happened between Israel and the Palestinians, particularly with regard to Gaza, the Egyptians, seem to have managed to avoid getting much attention there because they have held the line on the other side. They've managed to hold back or contain the Palestinians, at least certainly the Hamas government in Gaza as well.
But Mr. Burton's add on to this conversation, something that Mr. Hamdi talked about is that while we have seen, as he says, that the benefit of the nostalgia for Mubarak we are seeing going in the favor of the army here, but realistically speaking, the sentiment on the street, the situation in Egypt itself, how freely can Egyptians now speak when they're criticizing the current government?
I mean, I think one of the things we need to think about, obviously, there's the political dimension, and certainly, as your other guest was saying, one of the big problems that we face with the politics is, the lack of institutions, the lack of respect for those kind of democratic political institutions, and as a result, what you had was, yes, a political vacuum after 2011, and through that you had those who took part in the political process taking a very majoritarian view. They saw it as a very zero-sum game. Now, factor in the economic and social dimensions. One of the things that we overlook is the economic stagnation that took place in Egypt, during the course of the Morsi presidency, and which has pretty much continued. Egypt does not have a very strong or very robust economy. Unemployment, even though it's come down a little bit over the last few years, is not really generating enough jobs, especially for young people. The population is growing much larger, so there's going to be a growing number of people who need jobs. The nature of the economy is such that a lot of people rely on subsidies, financial assistance and handouts, government jobs as well. And because of that, the government is not really in a very productive position. So even though the current government of Sisi is able to clamp down and maintain political repression, the nature of people's day-to-day life is a very difficult one.
Mr. Hamdi, just on that, considering the kind of change that we're seeing in the Middle East, the kind of mini revolutions across the region, whether it is in Libya, whether it is in Iran or Lebanon, the question really is that today, can people in Egypt speak freely as compared to the time that when Mubarak was in power?
I think the biggest issue is not necessarily the revolution. People did revolutions. They brought down regimes. They brought down Ben Ali. They brought down Gaddafi. They brought down Mubarak. They threatened Assad. They're causing a crisis in Iraq where governments keep falling one after another. The problem is not necessarily that the people can't speak or the people don't want to move or the like. The problem is after these regimes fall, these are fledgling democracies. These are who want the most basic rights like Europe, like the US and the like. The problem is, however, that the international community has different priorities. Their priority is not democracy. Let me give you a classic example. You look at Libya, for example. Libya, you have a warlord back France, Egypt, who is about to overthrow an internationally recognized government. But the debate is not about the democratic process. The debate is not about this idea of Libyans having the ability to choose their leaders. The debate is about migration, it's about terrorism, it's about security, and it's about how to deal with radicalization. When you look at Yemen, for example, Yemen had a national dialogue. Ayza, all of the parties came together and they all agreed on a government. One militia with weapons, with the former president, overthrew that government, and suddenly now we are talking about trying to form a new government. There's no talk about rescuing the democratic process. No. It's about peace, it's about stability, migration, terrorism, and radicalization. These are the buzzwords. So when people are overthrowing these regimes and we have democratic elections, the debate is not, okay, this is fantastic, people are choosing their leaders. The debate is, you chose wrong. You did not choose who we wanted you to choose. Therefore, we will not allow you to manifest those democratic rights and powers that we enjoy in Europe and the US. No, and this is why when you talk about these revolutions and protests, people can talk, but without the help of the international community, they haven't been able to get anywhere.
But like you said, it's not in the interest of the international community. You listed what is really in the interest. And President Trump himself, the so-called fighter for democracy, he's called Sisi his favorite dictator, right? And let's not forget, during Mubarak's time also, it was a big threat when Sudan had seen its sort of short span of democracy. He viewed it as an inherent threat. Mr. Burton, do you agree with this opinion that despite what is happening in the region, that the Western priority right now is not about democracy or peace in Egypt? It's really about who they can have in power to bring to terms what they need first.
Yes, and I think, you know, when you talk about Trump, I mean, the quote he made was a very clear one. He doesn't make any effort to acknowledge democracy. Where you had, if we go back to 2011 though, and we look at what happened at the time of the revolution, there you saw a much more mixed signal coming out from the Americans. Don't forget, Obama made his first visit to, when he became president, his first visit as president to Egypt back in 2009, and he talked about democracy. But then he and his administration were paralyzed somewhat because the reality of, sort of the idealism of American support for democracy came up against the fact that, this was an autocrat who had basically served the Americans very, very well. Right. And this is the tension that the international community faces. Support and assist, those on our borders. We just want to contain the problem.
And so the situation is the same. The interests of whether Europe or the US, the West generally, are completely different from democracy. Their priority is, of course, combating terrorism and the migration issue. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Sami Hamdi and Mr. Guy Burton, for lending us your opinions here on Newswire. That's all the time we have for this week. We'll see you next week. Till then, goodbye.